trust is a name of a relationship between two parties. And those two parties have two distinct roles. It's always, you're either playing one role or the other. You're either trusting or you're being trusted. If you're trusting, the key aspect of trusting something is risk. It is a risk to trust somebody. If there's no risk, then it's not trust.
Welcome to the Curious Advantage podcast, an exploration of the idea of curiosity and its increasing importance for thriving in the digital age, from the authors of The Curious Advantage.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Curious Advantage podcast. My name is Simon Brown. I'm one of the co-authors of the book, The Curious Advantage, and today I'm here with my co-author, Garrick Jones.
Hi there.
Unfortunately, Paul can't be with us today. We're delighted, though, to be joined by Charlie H. Green. Hi, Charlie.
Good morning, good afternoon. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for joining us. A warm welcome to the Curious Advantage podcast. Charlie, you're a speaker, executive educator, founder, and chairman. You've authored 3 books, including the very well-known Trusted Advisor and a real specialist around trust. So maybe if we could just start with, could you share a little bit on your career journey with us and how you ended up where you are today?
Well, let's see. I'm American, you can tell already. I grew up in the Midwest, went to college in New York City, majored in philosophy, ended up getting an MBA at Harvard Business School, and I spent 20 years in the management consulting industry, and then took a couple-year hiatus to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up. Ended up falling in with 2 friends, and we co-authored the book that you mentioned, The Trusted Advisor. That was back in 2001, I think. And of the 3 of us, I'm the one that said, gee, this idea has legs. Let me see where it goes. And, over the next few years, I wrote a couple other books on the same general subject and founded this little firm called Trusted Advisor Associates. And fast forward, here we are today.
Fantastic. So I think all 3 books have got trust as a theme throughout them.
Yeah.
So what was it that resonated around trust? Why trust over all the other things that you saw in those 20 years as a management consultant? What was it that made trust resonate?
Well, myself and my co-authors, David Macer and Rob Galford, all of us had been consultants of some form or another. And as we glommed onto this idea of trusted advisor, it was a term that even back then had enough currency that you couldn't copyright it. So it was out there. Merrill Lynch was doing ads based on it. And we thought, nobody's written a book about it. And we had somebody else's model that we borrowed and tweaked called the trust equation. We thought there's something here. And we decided to write down all the mistakes and the horrible things that we did wrong as consultants so that nobody else would have to do them. We all believe that you learn more from failures than from reading successes. And we just built out the concept. So it was a little bit serendipity, a little bit gut feel. It was not a strategic decision. It just felt right.
I'm interested in some of the concepts you've got around trust, Charlie, like the difference between interpersonal trust and institutional trust.
My point of view is that one I call thin trust and one I call thick trust. Institutional trust, in my mind, is thin trust. It carries some of the components of the broader definition of trust, but only a few of them. And those tend to be quantitative, behavioral, things like confidence, reliability. But the deeper emotional components of trust really only show up in the interpersonal form of trust.
Yes.
And I think most of us walk around with an interpersonal trust model in our heads, and we kind of apply that to institutions. So I view, the interpersonal model as kind of more primary, more formal, more complex, more nuanced. And that's the one I tend to focus on. Not that I don't have things to say about institutional, but it's connected to that as well.
And we'll dive into those in a moment. You mentioned something in passing, though, that I'm curious to just quickly go back to, which was the trust equation. I recall in the past having seen the trust equation, but take us through, Charlie, what the trust equation is and how we can, I guess, apply it.
It will allow me to sort of pull back on that and give a bigger framework within which that fits.
Perfect, please. Yeah.
That would be helpful. Anybody listening to this, you see trust in the business press anywhere, and it's pretty vague, squishy, fog sculpting, not very well defined. And as an undergraduate philosophy major, that always bothered me. So I've tried to come up with a very precise, common sense, logical, inclusive, and exclusive notion of it. And here it is. The trust, the noun trust, is a name of a relationship between 2 parties. And those 2 parties have 2 distinct roles. There's a trustor and a trustee, one who does the trusting and one who is trusted. Now, it goes back and forth, between the parties, just like love or friendship, But it's always, you're either playing one role or the other. You're either trusting or you're being trusted. If you're trusting, the key aspect to trusting something is risk. It is a risk to trust somebody. If there's no risk, then it's not trust. Remember that old famous Russian proverb that Ronald Reagan made famous, trust but verify? No, that's not trust. That's a word game. The essence of trusting is thinking about risk-taking. The essence of being trusted, being trustworthy, is a little different. And that's where we get the trust equation that comes into play. 4 components. By our definition, it's not materially different from other models. There are many models out there, but in ours, it's credibility plus reliability plus intimacy, all divided by self-orientation. So CRIS, credible, reliable, intimate, self-orientation in the denominator. And we can explore each of those. But the first 2, credible, reliable, those are kind of the rational, behavioral, cognitive, quantitative kinds of components, the ones that most of us tend to focus on. The other 2, the intimacy and self-orientation, those tend to be much more emotional, much more elusive when it comes to quantifying. And it turns out those are actually, by some form of analyses, the more powerful, and certainly the ones that are less discussed, and I think end up being very relevant to the way that I look at in the world. So trusters, trustees, trust as a result. And if you want to diagnose a trust problem, you should start by saying, does the problem lie in the trusting or in the trustworthiness? Which one's lacking?
So can I just help me understand a little? It makes a lot of sense to me. The credibility plus reliability.
Yep.
And is that plus intimacy?
Yes.
And then it's divided by self-orientation.
Right.
And this is the question I have. Why is it divided by self-orientation? Self-orientation obviously has a huge impact on all 3 of those.
Yes, it does.
And possibly a negative impact if we're not careful.
Correct. That's why it's in the denominator. It goes the other way.
Got it.
The reason we did it that way, as I said, we inherited a form of that model which used a numerator over divisor format. And I always was intrigued by it. And we changed one factor, added another, but we kept that numerator divisor factor. And the reason is very simple. You could have flipped the denominator and called it other orientation, and you would have had a model that said C plus R plus I plus O. But that's boring. I mean, it would make people say, well, what about Q? What about R? Or why is one not redundant? This way, I find that people are naturally intrigued by an equation of that form, and it gets them thinking in ways that we never would have had it been a straight linear dynamic.
How does self-orientation affect credibility? How does it affect intimacy? And how does it affect reliability?
How does it affect curiosity, too, by the way? It's
very good.
We'll go there in a minute, yeah.
Well, let me lay that out.
Yeah.
Very quickly, credibility is like expertise, competence, credentials, that sort of thing. Reliability is dependability, predictability. We all get those. Those are fairly self-evident. Intimacy, a lot of my clients find, they're politically incorrect. They don't like to deal with that, but I mean it in a very intentional sense. It means the ability to be personal with somebody else, the ability to share things with somebody without fear that they're going to abuse your confidence, that sort of a thing. An intimate relationship is one in which you freely share at a personal level with another person, issues of importance. Self-orientation, the one in the denominator, is about 2 things. It's about who you're focused on and how much attention you're paying. If you're focused on yourself, that's called selfishness. That's a killer right off the bat. It colors your motives for everything. If you have a high self-orientation, and nobody's going to trust you because you're out for yourself. Fortunately, that's not a big deal usually in business. Bernie Madoff is no longer around, and there aren't that many of him. The other form, self-preoccupation, constantly neurotically worrying about yourself, is the most powerful form of self-orientation that we explore. And if you're always worried about yourself, if you take every comment as being about you, it's kind of a narcissistic disorder, if you will, you're not able to pay attention to others, to listen to others, to ask genuine questions. You're not able to be curious. I view, the ability to trust and be trusted is a precondition for curiosity. You can't be curious if you're neurotically self-obsessed all the time. So that's, I don't know how that rings with you guys, but
That's so true. I mean, honestly.
yeah.
I like that. So yeah, so if and I presume because it's the denominator at the bottom that can massively swing everything else. So if your self-orientation is seen as strong, it destroys everything above the line.
Well, yes and no. Let's not get our maths degrees too exercised here. The fact is, we laid it out that way. But if you examine it statistically, we did actually flip it in order to do a regression analysis and figure out which component was the most powerful by equally weighting them and analyzing them.
Yes.
And it turns out by a small margin, intimacy is the most powerful one, closely followed by self-orientation, and then much lower reliability, credibility. So it's the two emotional components that really carry the most weight in a trust relationship.
So diving into then the link between trust and curiosity. So so tell us more on how you see the relationship there, Charlie.
Well, I haven't really thought about it that much, other than people often do ask me, I come on a lot of podcasts like this and people say, well, what's your single best piece of advice? And I waver between saying, be a better listener, which is, kind of boring, but true. And cultivate an attitude of curiosity, which I view as much more interesting and really kind of profound. You want to be a trusted advisor? Cultivate an attitude of curiosity. It means you're other-oriented. It means you're self-secure enough in your own ego, in the good sense of the word, that you can afford to pay attention. You can, get over your damn self and pay attention to others. So it's a virtue which requires a certain strength of personal inner strength in order to do it. And many good things come from being curious. Very few bad things come from it, and many good.
Charlie, in your books, you mention that you can't have trust without connection.
Yeah.
And that seems to be buoyed up with your understanding of like intimacy and self-orientation.
Right.
What is the biggest thing we can do to connect to somebody else? I mean, you talked about curiosity, of course.
I would go to listening, paying attention, being curious. If you want to connect with somebody, you're not going to do it on an institutional level. Oh, you work for Ernst & Young, you work for FedEx, you work for Microsoft. You're not going to do it on a cultural level. Oh, you're English, you're Australian, whatever. It's got to be on a personal level, which means you have to engage with them about, who they are, who they see themselves as a being. How do you do that? You pay attention, you ask interesting questions, and you react to them. And you share how it impacts you, how you feel about that. So a personal dialogue, I think, is at the heart of that kind of connection.
There's a lot of research that shows that trust levels in wider society, whether that's in institutions, with governments, etc., are diminishing, which is a worrying statistic or fact to see. From all your work around trust, are there things that we can do to rebuild that trust or improve those levels of trust?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. They are declining. Every institution you can think of in most of the Western world has gone down in terms of perceived trust and so forth. Let's take the corporate world, for example. Say you're running a big company and you want to increase the perceived trustworthiness of your company. There are broadly two approaches, and I think one of them is better than the other, and it's not the one that's most commonly used. The one that's most commonly used is you hire a PR firm, you get good advertising, you show up at various places of interest, and you talk about how trustworthy you are, that sort of thing. That can move the needle, but it won't last very long if you can't back it up. If you tell people that you're trustworthy, I mean, look in the States, we have this great example of Wells Fargo Bank, which for the last 10 years has struggled to get out of the mire that it found itself in by some, egregious violations of trust. And one of the first things they did was advertise, we don't do that anymore. Well, it turns out they did. There goes one CEO and then on to the next. So it's a fast fix, but it's skin deep. The deeper solution is to start fixing the problem and wait on the communications. So if you could imagine waving a magic wand and let's say suddenly everybody in Wells Fargo or whatever company you want to pick suddenly personally became very trusting and very trustworthy in all their interactions with all their people, with customers, with each other, with suppliers. How long would it take for the public to notice that they were dealing with trusting and trustworthy people? Depending on the business, not that long. 4 months, 6 months, 8 months, 2 months, something like that. And that would be lasting. Now, you can't wave a magic wand and do that overnight. It's a longer-term cure, but I think that's the more powerful one. And it goes back to the notion of individual trust, an institutional one that you asked at the beginning. That I may say, I trust FedEx to deliver my packages, but if they screw it up twice in a row, I don't trust FedEx anymore. On the other hand, just because I trust FedEx does not mean I trust the FedEx driver to babysit my granddaughter. If I trust the FedEx driver and I have some kind of relationship, they know what time of day to deliver it, where on the porch to leave it, then I'm much more likely to trust FedEx as well. And that's a much longer standing kind of a relationship. So my general prescription is look internally, fix the people that are driving it, because the primary driver of trust ends up being interpersonal anyway. And that will reflect on the institution rather than trying to solve the problem at the institutional level. What somebody once said, what's the saying? Problems don't get solved at the level they're created. I don't know if that's applicable or not, but in this case, I think you don't solve institutional trust by working at that level. My opinion.
My sense is in the sort of digital world we have today with social media, with things like Glassdoor and Fishbowl and all of these other things, that that first approach of a sort of the PR sort of try and gloss over something is a very, very short-term view that the truth will very quickly out, and it needs to be genuine change, or that glossing over something is hard to do, I think, today.
Interestingly, if I recall, the history of the public relations industry, there were two proponents of PR back in the 20s, 30s, I forget what. And one of them, I think, was hired by Andrew Carnegie, because they had some problems at Carnegie Steelworks. They had some strikers, and he called in goons, and they shot the strikers dead. So that's a PR problem. And this guy came in and he said, first of all, no more shooting strikers dead. Let's start with that. And then we'll talk to the public. Well, his approach, sensible though it was, did not win out. And now the PR industry, of course, is totally focused on fix the external, fix the exterior, fix the communications first. Look at any big company you want, oil industry, all the scandals. That's what we have.
It's interesting because that feeds into a question I have around people who are different from us.
Yeah.
Trusting people who are similar to us is something, or finding intimacy, finding something we might have in common, or using inquiry, or being open and curious with people. I get that. What about if somebody has a completely different worldview from me, whether it be in terms of religion or gender or culture or politics? Let's say there is a really different person from somewhere else. Can I establish trust in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think you can. I'm an optimist in that regard. I think what it does is challenge our ability to be curious, to listen, to understand as objectively as we can be. We all have our biases. We all have our habits, and many of them we're unaware of. I mean, from my own life, for example, I was married for 7 years to a black woman from Queens, New York, and I'm a white kid from Nebraska. It's very different. And I'll tell you, it was one of the biggest learning experiences of my life. We're still good friends, and just enormous amounts of learning. But I think, we have to be good at recognizing our own biases, staying open to what we hear. But it's absolutely a worthwhile journey. I'd argue that there's a lot more to be gained by all parties involved, learning about somebody who's different than there is learning about a clone of yourself. We already know that one.
Charles H. Green is a speaker and executive educator focused on trust in complex businesses and professional services firms. And Charlie's the founder and chairman of Trusted Advisors Associates. In addition to the Trusted Advisor book, Charlie also wrote Trust-Based Selling, and he also co-authored the Trusted Advisor Field Book. He's a graduate of Columbia and, as we heard, also Harvard Business School, and he spent the first 20 years of his career with the Mac Group and its successor, Gemini Consulting. So let's dive a little bit into your second book, Charlie, of trust-based selling. So you connect the concept of trust with sales. I think I can see there's a logical link there. So how does trust play a part in the sales process? How can you foster trust, I guess, in the sales process? And what was the hypothesis in your second book?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking that question. It's probably my favorite book of the three, also the least selling. But a long time ago, and this came out of my experience as a consultant, hardly anybody in the consultative businesses at 19 years old said, I know what I want to do. I want to be a salesman. None of them. And yet, as you advance in the ranks, guess what? You have to sell. Well, that causes psychological problems for everybody coming up the ranks in any large consultative organization, whether it's lawyers or accountants or consultants, whatever. Gallup does a poll every year, most and least trusted professions. Salespeople are always at the bottom, bottom three. And I ask people on my webinars, who do you put at the bottom? They always mention salespeople. So there's this pervasive cultural subconscious negativity towards sales, which can't help but infect everybody in the Western world. They all feel the same way. So you're faced with this conundrum. We find people who want to have high-minded, client-centric, customer-oriented views, and yet they feel they have to do this horrible thing called selling, and it, among other things, it psychologically conflicts them. So that always interested me, and I've, throughout that book and thinking about it over the years, it's become kind of my favorite topic within the whole trust realm. And I'll sum it up this way: the problem with sales and the connection with trust is that from the outset, almost any sales training program you pick, almost any sales book you want to read, has one overriding goal and objective, and that is to improve your ability to sell. Now, think about that. That is right there, seller-centric. It is not buyer-centric. If your goal is to extract more money from your customer, guess what that's about? Talk about high self-orientation. At a conceptual, institutional level, that's where the rot comes from in sales. And the answer is one of the wonderful paradoxes of life. Just like happiness and a few other things, it comes about not by making it a goal, but by letting it be a byproduct. If you focus instead on helping your customers and your clients achieve what they want, guess what? That's who they want to buy from, people who help them. So you end up getting more sales by being 100% customer focused, but don't ever let it become the primary objective. One of the old managing partners of Goldman Sachs, I forget his name, but he had this phrase. He said, we're long-term selfish. Yeah, we're in it for the money. We like it. We want to get rich. That's why we're in this business. But we recognize that every transaction, every quarter, if that's what we focus on, we're no good. We have to focus on, helping our clients. And if we do that, we believe that we will become wealthy too. Well, he's right. Even though he's an investment banker, he's right about that. That to me is the interesting part of sales. And you can take that notion down into things. How do you handle objections? How do you handle pricing questions, pricing policy? How do you handle presentations, first meetings, decision making? Here's a little model, for example. Picture a meat sandwich. The bread are the beginning and the end of a sales process. The beginning is getting in the door. And you do that mainly through reputation and credentials. I've written these books. We have this list of clients. You can look at all these testimonials. That'll get you in the door. It won't get you the sale. Once you're in the door, you can't just keep hyping your credentials. You have to do something. And let's say then jump ahead. Let's say they make a decision and they choose you. The other piece of bread refers to how they rationalize it. No client in the world is going to spend $100,000, $1 million and say, well, we did it because, I don't know, we kind of like these guys. We sort of trust them. No, you get laughed out of the boardroom for that. What you do is say, well, we want them because they have a great track record and we did an analysis of the ROI and so developed. But the meat in the middle has nothing to do with that. The meat in the middle is this emotional, non-rational feeling that we go through, making up our minds, making a decision. And it sounds something like, I'm not entirely sure these guys are terribly better, but I trust them to be honest with us and open. I trust them to hold to our goals. We don't need a 100-page legal contract with these people. I think they're going to play straight with us. I think this is a good bet for us to do. Again, that's hard to defend in the boardroom after the fact, but it is in fact how human beings, even in organizations, make decisions. So you have this meat sandwich with rational bread and non-rational meat in the middle. That's an example of thinking about how I think of trust and sales.
That's fascinating. I have a question about your thoughts on trust in artificial intelligence, especially regarding issues like deep fakes. I mean, there's a trust issue there, right?
Oh, yeah.
How can we determine what's real and trustworthy, in your view, in this new AI-empowered digital world that we inhabit?
Well, you're certainly right. I mean, we're, with the new AI stuff, we're seeing a whole new wave of this. I don't think it's fundamentally different than when we first had voicemail or email or some other technological evolution. I'm sure, in the early days of the telephone, somebody figured out, fake phone calls, or what we now call phishing, and it fooled a few people, and it took a while. And now, 10 years ago, we had Nigerian princes emailing us saying, I got $10 million for you if you just send me your credit card. And we've all pretty much gotten to the point where we can smell a Nigerian prince from, you can see him coming. I kind of think we'll get there too. I mean, over here recently, we saw somebody put out a deep fake of Taylor Swift endorsing Donald Trump. And you look at that and you go, I don't think so. But here's this deep fake video. I think we're going to quickly get to the point where we say, no, it doesn't make sense. And maybe we may see some technical elements, but it's not going to be the technical stuff that solves it. I think our common sense is going to catch up with it. So I don't think, if the question is, how do I know whether or not to trust a deep fake? I don't think you're going to find the answer technically. You're going to find it in our cumulative experience that says, wait a minute, let's apply a does it make sense test here.
So we have in our book the 7 C's of curiosity, and one of those is around criticality, and I think that's incredibly important with what we're seeing with some of the developments of AI, either through intentional either deep fakes, or there's various other things where you hear now sort of for a small clip of audio you can replicate people's voice and things, and you hear of people using that for scams where you get a phone call from your child and it's not actually your child or whatever, and so I think there's that piece where that criticality piece of, does this feel right? Does this fit with everything else I know? The context I know, is this right?
There will always be con men.
Yep.
And we'll always get some victims.
Yep.
I just think it's going to happen at a higher level of rationality here with AI than it has before, but it's not qualitatively different.
And then the trust that comes out from the large language models as well, with the hallucination and things where things, not from any malicious perspective, just the way that the models work, that they create something looks incredibly convincing, but actually has been hallucinated and is not based on substance. So, I guess our ability to critically determine whether something is real or not it feels like going to become increasingly important in the world of AI.
Yeah, I would think so.
Overall, do you see that AI would make trust, or will help or sort of hinder trust in society? Do you have a perspective around where you see it getting better or worse in the future as a result of greater adoption of AI?
I don't have any great insight on that. I expect it will lower it for a while anyway, until we kind of catch up to it, because the capabilities of AI are pretty astonishing. We haven't seen this before at this scale. So I think it'll take a negative hit for a while. But ultimately, I mean, for example, I find it tremendously useful as a research tool. They're going to put Google search out of business. I'm not using Google search anymore. I use one of the AI tools because it gives me sources. It gives me much endeavor. So that I think will help, help on some level.
Coming to you personally then, Charlie, what are you curious about at the moment?
Good question. I am curious about AI. I find that fascinating. Lately, I have started for many years when I was running Trusted Advisor Associates, I wrote a blog and articles, maybe about 1,000 articles and blogs, mostly around trust. And when I semi-retired, I thought, I'd like to write something that has a little bit more to do with the interpersonal aspects that have some overlap with trust, things that we've been talking about. So I've started a LinkedIn newsletter called Breaking Good, like Breaking Bad, the TV show, Breaking Good. And it's about tales of inspiration and insight and, little moments or big moments of people in business, sometimes not in business, who have like epiphanies or who do something outstanding when you think about it. People that get over resentment. And there's one I wrote about a woman whose spouse was unfaithful. And she got over it in a week, which you think, wait a minute, that's not credible. Well, it is. I actually know the person. She legitimately figured out a way to process and accept and move forward with her husband in a positive way. And I asked her at the time, I said, just let me check that this is for real. What if he cheated on you again? And she said, oh, I'd be out of here in a minute. You only get one chance with me. I mean, that's just one example. People that do extraordinarily psychological things that, we think of it almost superpowers, if you will. So that's an area of interest, exploring more of the interior struggles that we all have.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time, so we've had a great conversation. Some of the things I've been scribbling notes down to sort of summarize our conversation. So we've gone through your background from management consultancy and how you then wrote The Trusted Advisor, how you saw that actually it was an idea with legs and that actually you could go on and dive deeper into trust. We went into the trust equation and understood a bit about the different elements of trust, where we have the trustor and the trustee, the element of risk around trust and becoming trustworthy, and then the trust equation being credibility plus reliability plus intimacy, all divided by self-orientation. So one for us all to think about of how actually we can create trust. We heard about becoming a better listener and cultivating an attitude of curiosity. How when we think about trust, there's both an interpersonal level and an institute level, but really it's at the personal level where it's really most powerful. And then dived into the declining level of trust in society, what people can do when there's declining trust. So there's the short-term fix of hire a PR firm, or the deeper solution of actually fix the problem. And I think we're all in agreement that the first one is probably not really a viable solution for the long term. Dived into then trust and sales, and learnt about the meat sandwich. So with the bread being the beginning and the end of how we rationalize it, the meat being the trust, the emotional, irrational piece that sits in the middle, and then into trust in AI and whether it's hallucination or deep fakes, but what the impact of AI is going to be. So lots there. If there was one thing, Charlie, for our listeners to take away from all of that, what would be your parting words?
Well, I'll tell you what, before this conversation, I didn't have an answer to that. But now, just given the dialogue we just had, here's what I would say. I work mostly with, professional people, largely in intangible services and B2B sales. And a question a lot of them have is, how can I affect the institution? How can I do something? And my suggestion is always work on yourself. Start with yourself. Much of what I've talked about doesn't have to wait for your boss's permission. It doesn't have to wait for there to be a corporate initiative. You can do this stuff right away this afternoon by yourself. You don't need permission for anybody, and you don't need much training. We all get the kind of stuff that I've been talking about. It's innate, commonsensical. Trust your gut. Was it Gandhi or somebody who said, be the change you wish to see in the world? It's a great saying. I think we underestimate the power of personal agency and a willingness to do the right thing. It ends up being a role model for other people. It gives other people courage. So don't bemoan the state of the world. Fix the piece of the world that you touch, which is, in the end, pretty much all you can do anyway. And, let the world take care of itself. Do the best you can do to be the best you can be. That would be my message based on our discussion here today.
Love it. And start with yourself. There's no reason not to get started. So
right.
Be the change you want to be in the world. Charlie, thank you so much for a great conversation.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Charlie.
You've been listening to a Curious Advantage podcast, so we're always curious to hear from you. So if you think there was something useful or valuable from our conversation today, then please do write a review for the podcast on your preferred channel and say why this was so and what you've learned from it. We always appreciate hearing our listeners' thoughts and having a curious conversation, so use the hashtag CuriousAdvantage. The Curious Advantage book is available on Amazon worldwide if you want to dig deeper into our 7 C's model for being more curious. Order your physical, digital, or audiobook copy now to explore how you can build your curiosity muscle. Subscribe to the podcast today and follow The Curious Advantage on LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube to keep exploring curiously. Thanks very much, and see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Curious Advantage podcast.
The Curious Advantage book is now available to purchase on Amazon.
Stay tuned for the next episode and keep exploring curiously. This podcast is produced by Aliki Palinelli and John McGinty and edited by Jill Damatak-Futter.